For our next session, we're tackling one of the most concerning issues of our time, the rise of extremist groups and the vulnerability of young people to radicalization. And we're delighted to welcome back Councillor Maajid Nawaz, who himself was radicalized. He became an international recruiter for Hizb ut-Tahrir and was imprisoned in Egypt for 5 years. He became disenfranchised with radical Islam in prison, and since his release has set up the world's first counter-extremism think tank, the Quilliam Foundation. It advises governments all over the world on countering violent extremism and preventing radicalization. A true inspiration and a leader in his field, which sadly is more important today than ever, please welcome Maajid Nawaz.
Good morning. We're about to discuss one of the most important and pressing topics of the day. Let me begin by apologizing. This panel is now half the size it was meant to be. So we were meant to have here Darren Clift, who is a former far-right extremist, and Sohail Ahmed, who is a former jihadist. I apologize for their absence. They didn't get their visas for various reasons of security-related concerns. I do have with me Soren Lerche, who is a former far-left agitator. And as you just heard, I'm Maajid Nawaz, who will be hosting this session with now one person. Now, this panel almost didn't happen because as I arrived at the airport yesterday, the panel was about to happen and commence in the immigration secondary inspection security room because the two of us were held for secondary questioning. But we made it through. How long were you held for, sorry?
9.5 hours.
9.5 hours. I made it for the dinner, and that's why I'm wearing a roll neck now because it was freezing, but this poor guy was held for 9.5 hours. I did tell him earlier, when I just saw that he did eventually get through, that he's had a better treatment than when I first tried to come into the United States of America because I was also similarly held. He had his fingerprints taken. I had mine taken back in 2008. I had my DNA taken. When they eventually let Soren through, a police inspector had to finally give him permission personally to come in and take responsibility for anything that might happen. In my case, it was slightly more complicated, and they insisted I had 24-hour armed federal guard. And they put a sniper in the hotel room opposite me. I'd only come to testify at the Senate. But anyway, we're going to commence with the one panelist that is here, but it does point to the difficulties of us having this conversation. How many of you attended my session last year in Thailand? Woo! Yeah, right. So you guys are going to remember I mentioned something that I called the Voldemort Effect, yeah? And that was our inability to have this conversation, and how important it is that we have a little Harry Potter out there that can say, this is not he who must be named, he who must not be named, this is Voldemort. And to call the thing by its name and to have that candid and frank conversation. Because if we're not having the conversation, the alternative, unfortunately, is violence. And we're seeing too much of that. So the only way forward is to talk about it. And that's why we're here. But it points to the difficulties of having this conversation. There are understandable reasons why the other two panelists couldn't have been here, but it does point to some of the challenges that are involved in us having this open conversation. The reason we wanted to have a former jihadist, a former far-left anarchist, and a former far-right extremist is because this panel would have been the microcosm of the bigger problems playing out across the world right now, with the rise of far-right extremist populism, with the rise of far-left extremist agitation, and with the rise of Islamist extremism as well. So this panel would have been an insight on a micro one-on-one level to that macro problem that all of us are living through at the moment. Nevertheless, we will try, the two of us, to get through as much as we can on that subject of that triple threat of extremisms in the plural, all competing for your attention. We must have this conversation. Soren, welcome to One Young World.
Thank you.
Please give him a warm welcome. He had 9 hours. I'm going to ask you a question before I do. Those of you who are in on the inside joke, I have my coffee with me, but you know that requires explanation. Look it up. Soren, tell us about your background. Tell us a short synopsis of who you are and what brings you to this stage here.
I was part of the extreme left wing for 8 years. I started in '94 and got out in 2002. We saw as main target and enemy as the fascist movement and the capitalist, and we were doing a huge protest, demonstration, street violence, and attacks on neo-Nazis.
You were violently attacking the neo-Nazis?
Yeah.
And did you end up in prison for that? Did anyone convict you, or what happened? I mean, did you get off?
Yeah, we didn't. We were not charged of the political crime we did, but we went into organized crime where we also did dealing of marijuana, and in that way.
Which is decriminalized in many states now. You would have been okay with that.
Still not in Denmark.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. Yeah. So. Talk us through this. You're a young man, and you're angry at the far-right extremists. But, you know, a lot of people get angry at them and don't necessarily resort to violence. So talk us through the journey you went through in your mind that allowed you to end up justifying physical attacks against neo-Nazi skinheads.
Yeah. When I was a young man...
Can I just stop you a moment? By the way, physical attacks, most people are scared of those guys. Right? You would actually go out and hunt them.
I think I was scared of them as well.
Right.
I had dreadlock, I was not very big, and at that time, and when I was walking the streets and saw people in black jackets and shaved heads with the Danish flag on their shoulder, then I was scared. I had pepper spray in my pocket and was always prepared to defend myself because I heard all the stories of the neo-Nazis attacking left wings, homosexuals, and immigrants. It was only stories. I actually didn't know anybody been attacked, but at the gymnasium where I was studying, it was a far-left gymnasium. It said on the walls that was sprayed, "Die neo-Nazi" and "Fight neo-Nazis." And there was a story, a narrative of the way to a better society was to fight them. Today, I work together with former neo-Nazis, and I have very good friends of former neo-Nazis. And I have seen that many of them are hurt children that hurt other children, that I have managed now to look behind the anger, behind the violence, and I think it's the best way to address violence is to see the individual, the person behind the swastika, and not hurt them.
You see, this is a process I call rehumanization, when you have defined the other, and that other is just this thing, this non-human object that is the enemy. I remember in prison in Egypt, one of the most important aspects of my own turnaround was when Amnesty International adopted me as a prisoner of conscience at the age of 24, 25, and it was the first time that the other had treated me in a human way, to my own perception. And that softened my heart. I think the process of rehumanization in de-radicalization is crucial, but how do you go about broaching a conversation with somebody you can't even get near because there's a barrier, and that barrier is violence?
Yeah. And it was very difficult because we never spoke to each other. We only fought each other. So the first time I met a neo-Nazis was 10 years after I left the movement. And I was doing a conference on extreme movements, and I talked to the security police, and I wanted a speaker from a far-right movement. And they introduced me to a man I would love to sit together with today, Thomas Runge. And he invited me to his house, and he didn't know my background. So before he told me his story, I said, I have to tell my story. I've been part of a violent anti-fascist crew, and he knew this crew, and they were very scared of this crew. And he said, this is very scary for me that you just sit in my room, in my living room, and tell me this. But actually, I think the story he told me, he was beaten up by a fist from his father when he was 5 years old. And he was introduced to violence the whole life. And when he was 10, he was doing hard drugs. And then he became into the violent scene. He was 14 years old. He had a swastika on his chest. At the end, he had 75 swastikas tattoos on the whole body. There was a lot of anger. And what he found out was that he was angry at himself and his father. But he had attacked a lot of left wings, a lot of immigrants, and today he's a lovely father and a very good friend of mine.
Now, you've just humanized the experience of this man. Let me talk a bit about another absentee panelist, and that's Sohail Ahmed, the former jihadist I mentioned. Sohail was a recruiter in London for this phenomenon of terrorism, and some of the people he recruited have gone off abroad to join terrorist organizations. But Sohail began questioning and following a lot of the work that we do at Quilliam. But then there was a fascinating twist, which is why I wish he was here, because Sohail discovered, being a jihadist recruiter, he discovered his own sexuality and came out after leaving this group, also came out as gay, which you don't often hear a perspective of somebody like that. Now, he's unable to be here, but he was very active, he was vocal. You'll find an interview of him on the Rachel Maddow show after the Orlando massacre, speaking of homophobia and of somebody who used to think like Omar Mateen, the guy who killed all those poor people in Orlando, and then actually he discovered he was gay himself. And so it's a fascinating story. Unfortunately, he's not here, but do look him up. So I want to ask you now, Soren, you've just humanized this process of this former neo-Nazi who's a friend of yours. He was subjected to violence and he, in turn, became violent to others. But you were violent to them. Were you subjected to violence yourself? I mean, how did you justify your own violence?
Yeah.
Because this guy was scared of your group.
Yeah, I'm from an academic family, a middle-class family. My parents was left-wingers, but they were very against violence. It was forbidden at our house to see Tom and Jerry. It was too violent. Yeah, so it was a long process for me to be violent. I remember when I was 13 years old, I was at a party and a young man hit me in the face, and some of the elder people, a bit older people from my town, caught him and said, "Son, hit him, hit him." And I couldn't make myself hit him. When I'm a teacher today, and I talk with my students, a lot of young people can't hit another people with a fist in their face. So it is a process to build up that hate. And I think in school, when I was young, I was confronted with violence from the teachers. I was bad at spelling and reading, and it was difficult for me to sit still on the chairs. So I was using more time outside the classroom than inside the classroom. And I started smoking marijuana every day from I was 15 to 20. And I think when I started at this gymnasium, which was very left-wing, I felt like home. I had dreadlocks, and when I took the train from the Sabbath and into the gymnasium, I was feeling at home, and I wanted to be so much part of that community there. In the start, it was partying, it was doing drugs, and being part of this community. We did huge concerts and demonstrations, and we had squatted houses we couldn't live in. So it was very much the social environment that I was drawn into. Yeah.
Did anyone try and then break down for you why it was justified? Was there any theory involved, or was it all about belonging to this group that you wanted to fit in with?
I think there was the story about the far right as somebody who was threatening our democracy, threatening immigrants and homosexuals and left-wing. And it was a great honor for us to be the people who was standing in first line and fighting these, who got the first call when they were seen in the streets, who knew how to attack when there was concerts and demonstrations. So I think the lack of self-esteem I had in school, I got that by going into this violent group.
So now let me ask you, because you and I here my background is somebody who was radicalized after the genocide in Bosnia. And domestically, I was born and raised in Essex, if anyone knows Essex in the United Kingdom. Yeah. So we have a great reputation. So there was a lot of neo-Nazi violence that I experienced. So I was the kind of guy that wanted guys like you to fight next to me to fight these skinheads. Now, I'm going to be a bit fair here because the former skinhead guy's not here, right? So, but to be honest, I think that everyone in this room would probably have more sympathy for me being radicalized because the skinhead's trying to hit me around the head with a hammer, which is true, and stab me with machetes, and then the genocide in Bosnia, which no one wants to see a genocide happen, right? So when I talk, people sympathize with why I got angry and why I joined an Islamist organization. Likewise, when you say that you wanted to protect them from bashing gays, you wanted to protect them from, you protect immigrants because these guys were hunting immigrants, they can sympathize with your story and my story. It may be harder for the audience here to sympathize with a former far-right extremist, right? But what I want to ask now is, what would you say to somebody who sympathizes with actually direct action against these people? What is wrong with it? You know, why do you now do what you do? Because you could have just stopped, retired, and everyone would have been like, we understand why he hated neo-Nazis. But you're going around warning people not to go down that path. What is so bad about kind of trying to take that direct action against people that are chasing people that look like me with hammers?
Yeah. First of all, violence creates more violence. So when we attacked neo-Nazis in Copenhagen, then in another part of Denmark, they attacked left-wingers. They attacked the immigrants to do revenge of the attacks we did in Copenhagen. So it was pretty secure for us to walk around Copenhagen because we were a lot of people, and every time we saw a neo-Nazi, we attacked them. But we actually created more violence by being violent for people who liked violence, who have been brought up with violence. They knew the communication of violence. They actually enjoyed the violence. I know a former skinhead from United States, and he said, when we were standing 5 and you were 500 against us, then we felt like we had the power. We were 5 against 500, and when you were throwing stones and bottles at us, we were saying, you are the people who are not Democrats. You were standing with peace signs, but you were actually doing the violence. So we were building up to their story as we were the enemy, and they had the right to fight us with violence as well. So the violence created more violence. And as I can see it, one of the great organizations that I admire is from Sweden, Fryshuset, that have helped 800 people out of the extreme right by mentoring them, reaching out with their hands, involving former neo-Nazis in the work, in the community, and being part of our society. I think many of these people leaving the movement, they leave because they meet kindness instead of hate.
Talk to us then, people leaving the movement are known as formers, yeah? Former far-right extremists, former Islamists, or former jihadists, depending on whether they've been violent, and former far-left. Talk to us about what you think the role of formers can be in having this conversation, not just to de-radicalize, but also to speak to people like this. You know, what could they possibly gain from hearing from people such as yourself?
I think it's very difficult to understand why people get into violence and why people attack people they don't have any relation to. I think it's important to understand the path to the violence, the history behind the violence, to see people as they're unique people as they are. They can also be a wonderful brother, they can be a football coach, but they are also part of extreme gang or extreme violent group. And we have to build on that. We have to build on the positive things. And for myself, when I was sitting 2 months by myself in prison, I was not communicating with anybody or other. I was sitting 24 hours in my cell. I had letters from my parents. I had letters from my sister. And at that time, they started motivating me. It was very difficult for them communicating with me while I was in the movement, but at this time, they could reach out and they motivated me to start my high school again and go into university.
So let me ask you there, we just had this attack in New York, the New York bomber, alleged, he's arrested, or detained at least. And it turns out that the father had an inkling or a suspicion that his son was changing. Now, we're involved, Quilliam is involved in supporting this initiative called FATE, Families Against Terrorism and Extremism, because we believe that if anyone is going to see or notice signs of, look, from across Europe, you've got up to 6,000 born and raised European citizens who went to join ISIS. If anyone, it's about 1,000 from the UK alone, right? If anyone is going to start noticing signs of these people changing, it's going to be their parents, their siblings, their wives, their loved ones, basically. So with this initiative, we believe that if we can teach and train families in picking up those early warning signs so that they can notice that their loved ones are becoming radicalized, and then actually beyond radicalization, train them in how to provide better intervention. I think that's the purpose of this initiative called FATE. Now, I mention this because, like you've said, when I was in prison, my mother's support for me, while constantly maintaining her opposition to my views, was crucial. I'm now a relatively known counter-extremism activist, but I often say that the first counter-extremist I ever met was my Muslim mother. And she was the genesis for me setting up Quilliam and everything Quilliam is doing now. So tell us about your insights in terms of the importance that the role family can play and how important it is to keep that human connection alive through family.
Yeah. I'm also a mentor for gang members who want to leave the movement. And I was sitting together with a mother. She was starting to build up her own parent network. And I was invited to the meeting and we were talking. And I said, if you see some opening in your son, then I'm ready to meet him. And then the Sunday morning I got a call and she said, he would like to meet you now. And I came Sunday morning and talked to him. And it was the first time in 5 years that he actually had a conversation with another adult, she said. And I think that you as a parent are very close to your sons, but you don't know how to take these discussions. It can be very difficult. As a parent, you can also see the beautiful things in the son. The police can maybe only see the anger and all the crime you do, and the prison service as well, and maybe also the school. But as a parent, you also have a love of your son. And we built up a very close relation, me and the son, and I did the mentoring and helped him out of the gang and into education and job. And I also had a lot of talks with the mother and helping her to build up this parent organization. I think it's so important to involve the parents, but sometimes the parents are also very hurt. So they need the support, and they also need to understand what their sons and daughters are going through.
Or
and
brothers or sisters.
Yeah, and they need also to talk with other brothers and sisters and other parents how to deal with this situation. So it's fantastic what you're doing with FATE, and I know several of the people organized in that.
What do you think are the similarities, if there are any, not to put words in your mouth, between those who join neo-Nazi groups, those who join far-left extremist groups, and those who join jihadist groups? Are there some patterns that you can detect that can help people understand all three of these, of this triple threat, of this phenomenon?
I think most of us are some kind of hurt, that we don't feel belonging in the society, that we create our own community which is opposed to the society, and then we want to create a better world. Actually, I think every organization has this dream of a better world. And I think when we work with these groups, we can also try to turn the anger into something positive. There can be some positive in the anger. So to recognize that you were very angry about the unfairness you saw and the right-wing extremists today that is very concerned about refugees. We have to be in dialogue with it. We cannot just say we don't want to discuss this, that we have the right. We have to be in dialogue constantly, and then aim of the same goal as bringing people together and try to challenge each other's youth and building up a better society. And that what I can see now today, I'm part of Serve to Unite, where there's a son who lost his father in a temple shooting, working together with a former right-wing extremist. He had to understand why a former extremist, why a right-wing extremist shot his father and 6 other people in the temple. He had to understand that, but he also had to bring something good into the world, to build up a better world, a better community. And today they are working together with 600 people in Milwaukee on schools and empowering them to create a better world. And that's what we also want to do in Denmark.
These are some of the most difficult conversations to have, and they require stepping above party politics. They require stepping above our own hurt, our own pain. I've sat on a panel like this in Europe where the former far-right extremist, because he was in Europe, was able to attend. These are people that used to chase me with hammers and have hit my friends with hammers in the head, have stabbed my friends. And I've sat and spoken to people that are from the Egyptian regime, and I've watched people tortured to death in prison. But these are some of the most difficult conversations, but we have to have them. And so I want to just end on this note to say that if we're not speaking about this, if we're not having these uncomfortable conversations, then the only alternative is violence. So we have to keep speaking, and we have to keep trying to understand what's going on in the world so that we can all understand each other. And as we've just heard, ultimately there is a seed of humanity left in everyone. And on that note, I can see somebody creeping up right here. Peripheral vision, right? So we're going to end there. Thank you very much. Soren Lerche, thank you. Thank you.